Observing challenges students faced in studying sparked her own interest in understanding the underlying reasons and finding ways to assist them. At UT Austin, which I had a chance to visit last year, her research focuses on effective learning strategies for long term retention, motivational factors hindering effective studying, and ways to integrate these strategies into classrooms. And Stephanie believes that this is an undertaking for both educators and students. We need both members to participate. And she's been focusing on finding ways that educators can apply effective strategies in the classroom that are time efficient, very practical, and help students become better self-regulated learners. This is Stephanie's first time ever in Canada, and she's already discovered Tim Hortons. She's been visiting Tim Hortons every morning. Please join me in welcoming Stephany Rea.
So thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be here in Canada and at EdCog, my first time here. So thanks, Dr. Kim, for introducing me. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my work here today about barriers to effective and active self-regulated studying. So I would like to first start and talk a little bit about my journey and why I research what I do. So I was born and raised in São Paulo, Brazil. And ever since I was a little kid, I really enjoyed learning, asking questions, reading books. I always bothered my mom to buy more books, and I always got good grades in school. So after high school, I decided to follow the traditional path that a lot of my cousins and classmates were following, which was to go to college. I started college as a business major, and I quickly realized that I did not like being a business major student. I just couldn't picture myself doing that as a career. And that was the first time that I actually struggled with my academics. I was not doing well, I was not motivated, and my grades definitely reflected that. As I mentioned earlier, I used to be a very good student, so to me that was a really hard thing to experience because it was the first time that I was actually failing classes. So after 2 semesters, I decided to become a English and Portuguese translator interpretation major. As I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy reading books. I always have. And a lot of my favorite authors were writing their books in English. So I thought that a great career for me would be to be translating some of these books. Get to read them before everyone else. How awesome would that be? So while I was enjoying a lot of my classes as an English and Portuguese major, translated major, there was one thing that I was lacking, which was I didn't know English. Which, thinking back now, why did I sign up for an English and Portuguese major if I didn't know English? I actually just thought that I could learn the language during my classes, but the necessary skills for the language to be that major, to be in that program, I didn't have that. I really lacked that prior knowledge. So again, I was struggling with my academics. Now I enjoyed my classes, but I lacked the prior knowledge to succeed in them. So then I had the brilliant idea to take some time off of my undergrad studies in Brazil and do an exchange program in the US so I could learn the language in a fast and intense way. So I moved to the US in 2014. I went to America as an au pair. Are you guys familiar with that? Okay, so I went to the US as an au pair to learn English, and I did that. It was a very difficult thing for me to do. I didn't really know English that much, and being in a foreign country where everyone just spoke in English was a very difficult thing to do. Luckily, I had my host kids, and they helped me a lot. They were not embarrassed to tell me I was saying things wrong, incorrectly. They were not afraid to laugh at me when I was pronouncing things incorrectly, but that actually helped me a lot. So to me, it was very rewarding to notice that both of us, me as their caregiver in a way, was teaching them a lot of things, but they were also teaching me to learn the language. Those little kids, so small, so cute. they were teaching me a lot. So after learning the language for a few years, working and traveling, I decided to go back to school. At that point in my life, I was actually missing school. I miss being a student. I miss being in the classroom. As I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy learning, so I actually missed that. So I decided to enroll at a community college as a psychology major. At that point in my life, I was older. I had experienced some struggles in academic. So going back to school at a community college, I had a very different approach to my studying. I was trying to be more strategic. I was paying attention to my schedule. I was trying to be very effective in terms of how I was studying for my classes. I was prioritizing that in my life. And I was succeeding in my classes. I was actually doing pretty well. So after earning my associate's degree at the community college, I transferred to Quinnipiac University. And there I earned my bachelor's in psychology in May 2021. Okay, so now you may be asking why I'm telling you all of this. You don't really care about my love for books. But I'm not entirely sure if it was because I was older or a non-traditional student at a foreign university, or if it was because I struggled in academic and really realized that I need to change my approach to studying, going back to school. I started to notice patterns among my peers. The first thing that I noticed, which was really nice, was that despite complaining about everything that my peers had to do for our classes, they actually enjoyed learning. They were passionate about class discussions or projects that they were working on, or even in presentations. Despite that passion for learning or different topics that they were experiencing in the classroom, a lot of my peers struggled to study effectively. I don't know why they realized this, maybe because I was older than them or because I was doing well in my classes, but a lot of my peers would come up to me and ask for help. They would ask me to hold study sessions. They would ask me to share materials that I was using to study for our exams, share with them. But they also were asking what I thought at the time were simple questions that they should know, which would involve when were things due. So noticing those things, I realized that a lot of my peers needed help. And while I was very thankful to help them as much as I could, I was asking myself, how can I help students more broadly? While I was helping my peers, I noticed and I realized that they were not the only students that were struggling. And I wanted to help them somehow. So that's what I have been doing at UT Austin for the past 3 years. And I'm here today to share a little bit what I have found thus far while trying to help students to be more effective with their studying. Okay, so enough about me. I shared a little bit about some of the things that I noticed about students, but I would love to hear the things that you guys in the room have experienced, maybe as teachers, as students, or researchers. What were the patterns that you noticed about students in terms of what good students do? So let's take 5 minutes to think about some of those patterns or experiences that you remember about your students and what they were doing that made you notice that they were good students, that they were studying effectively. Let's think about them, share with your neighbor, and then maybe in 3 minutes or so, we can share with the room things that came up in those conversations. Because I want to hear from you guys too. I don't want to be the only one talking. You guys probably have way more interesting stories than I do to talk about. So yeah, let's chat. Okay, does anyone would like to share some of the things that came up while you were talking? Yeah, Joe?
So Pauline and I discussed that I think some students with good intentions just use brute force to try to get everything ready for, and they're kind of just studying everything.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas good students, they listen to the hints that their instructor says, like, a lot of students get this wrong on exams.
Mm-hmm.
And I think really good students can anticipate test questions. And then we also mentioned that good students also know when to stop and go to sleep.
Very important. No all-nighters. Okay, does anyone else would like to share things that came up in conversations?
We talked a lot about organization. So good students have like time management apps. Notion was one that we mentioned. And just prioritizing, I guess, kind of ties into what Joe said. But yeah, time management, like having a schedule, having a calendar, really,
Yes.
allotting your time correctly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that organization came up with the audience online as well. Okay, what else?
So basically, I'm coming from more the elementary spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So good students are like more polite and kind, and then they more focus when they're like have good attitudes, and then they make more friends. I found that like more students are more, even if there's depending on the socioeconomics,
Mm-hmm.
good students either really try really hard, or they find ways of doing what they have. If they're from high economic standards, they have more access to more resources, which they learn how to develop more strategies. It usually depends on, I'm more looking at it from a social perspective, from the academic, from elementary school perspective. So
yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, so does anyone else would like to share?
Good students, they are very curious and they always want to ask questions. So most of them during the class, they ask a lot of questions. After the class, they still want to engage with the instructor to ask several questions. The reason being that most of them, they even read ahead of the instructor, and a lot of things that they want to know about their study.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing that I've noticed is, I guess I could summarize it as grit. So students who often are, I don't know, however we define success, don't tend to see failure as failure. They come and they face it head on as a challenge and try to learn from it as opposed to hiding from it and not face it at all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for everyone that shared, that engaged in this mini activity. I loved hearing from you guys. So some of the things that came up is good students are organized, they ask questions, they are strategic about what they're studying, right? It's not only absorbing all the information that they're given to, but also they are strategic about the topics that they're choosing to study. And facing failure as something that will help them grow rather than something that will deplete them in a way. So thanks for everyone for sharing that. And a lot of those things, a lot of the things that you guys shared, you're going to see in my presentation. So I loved that. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit into self-regulated learning and what that involves a little bit. In order to have effective approaches to learning, students really need to know good strategies that they should be using to study effectively. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about effective strategies and what they look like in a little bit. But I wanted to highlight this because knowing what to use to study, being strategic, like Joe and Paulina mentioned, is very important in order to be an effective studying or self-regulated student. In addition to that, metacognition is a very important piece of self-regulated learning as well. So this is the facet of self-regulated learning in which students are reflecting on their learning progress. So now you could know what to use effectively, what strategies to use effectively. But if you don't reflect on your learning and when you're ready to move on to the next topic, or when you're confused about something and you need to actually revise that topic or seek out other resources, the learning strategies themselves are not going to be that useful by themselves. So good habits, good self-regulated habits that students may have will involve learning strategies that are effective for learning and that self-reflection that they are continually doing when they're learning new things. But while those things are very important to self-regulated learning, motivation will play a huge role in the way in which students are approaching those things. So in my work, I have focused on all these three components of self-regulated learning while trying to support students to become more effective with their studying. So I do that by guiding students to use better strategies, understand them, and I try to focus that or implement those things into instructional designs. I also try to understand students' motivation, their goals, or barriers that they perceive while trying to become self-regulated learners. In my work, I don't aim to change motivation. I know there is a whole field of motivation that often implements interventions to change students' motivation, to help them realize some things in the classroom that may be good for their learning. But in my work, I don't do that. I rather try to understand students' motivation and try to help them align whatever motivation, whatever goals they might have for a class with good studying habits. So one of the things that came up from you guys in the audience about what good students do is that facing failure as an opportunity to grow is one of the things that make good students a good student. I don't know where I was going with that. But quickly in my work, I realized that the perceptions of failure or difficulty in educational context is not aligned with that mentality of failure as something that you can use to grow. I have definitely thought things like this, that learning should feel easy, that if I'm struggling, that means I'm not cut out for this. I shared with you guys my experience in undergrad in Brazil. I was struggling with my classes. I was like, this is not for me. I can't do this. I should change it. And sometimes that is true, but this perception of failure that does not equal to learning, that's a problem. Students also often think that when things feel hard to them, that means that they're not learning or something is not working for them. A strategy is not working for them. But now when we think about different contexts, learning and failure, they match. So let's think about the gym. There's this culture at the gym that I'm confident that a lot of you guys heard before. It's very simple. Does anyone want to guess? Yes, no pain, no gain. If you're not working hard at the gym, you're not growing. In order to become stronger, you need to work hard. The challenge at the gym is fun. If you run 1 mile today, you might want to run the extra mile the next day. Not me, but some of you might. So how can we incorporate this perception of learning and challenges that we often see in other contexts and bring that to the educational context? And you may be thinking, but you may be thinking, why is this an issue? Well, a lot of the effective approaches to learning is challenging. So let's talk about desirable difficulties. I will very briefly describe some of the strategies that fall into this umbrella so we are on the same page when I move on and talk about some of the barriers students face in using these strategies. Okay, so what are desirable difficulty strategies? So these are strategies that are good for long-term retention of materials, that makes learning often feel more difficult, more effortful, because students are required to be more active and engaged when using these strategies. So some examples of what these strategies look like are active retrieval. So this is a strategy in which students are trying to recall information from memory rather than looking at their notes. This active engagement of trying to remember things that you learned before from memory and not relying on notes, we will make this strategy very powerful because now students are making those memories of materials that they learned even stronger. We also have elaboration, as the name suggests. This is a strategy in which students elaborate on topics. So they might ask questions like, why is this topic? Why is this modeled this way? Or they might think about other classes that they can relate to the topic that they're learning other classes, making these connections. Or maybe even thinking of examples that they have in their own personal lives and apply those different examples and experiences, their prior knowledge, to new information that they're learning. And the fact that they're now connecting all these different examples and experiences and topics will make this strategy very powerful, because now their memory is not only about the new topic that they learned, but now this new topic is connected to all these other things in their lives. So when they think about this topic in the future, they are more likely to recall it because it's connected to other things in their memory. We also have spaced or distributed practice. And this is a strategy in which students, they space out their study. So they give some intervals between study sessions. This strategy is more powerful than studying everything on in one big chunk or one big study session, because every time students break down their study session and they go back to it, they have to reflect back on the things that they studied previously. And again, just exercising those things that they have in their long-term memory and bring that back every now and then will make the memories of the things that they're learning even stronger. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about interleaved practice. This strategy, in my opinion, is the most counterintuitive strategy that follows in this desirable difficulty umbrella. But this is a strategy in which students are mixing topics that they learn in their classes and study them in a mixed manner. So it's very common for students to practice some questions from week 1. Then once they are done with that, they practice questions from week 2. After they're done with that, they go and move on and practice questions from week 3, following this chronological order of things. But the literature says that when students mix those practice problems from different weeks and different time points, it's better for learning, because now not only they have to remember what those topics that they learned in classes were about, now they have to also distinguish different problems depending on the week. And again, this active, effortful exercise of this distinguishing topics and remembering them will make the memories of the things that they are studying even longer. Okay, so these strategies have been investigated by cognitive and educational researchers for decades now, and maybe a lot of you guys in this room know why they work, what they are, and you believe in the evidence that they work. But what researchers know and what students do, that's a completely different story. So let's think a little bit about how students are perceiving these strategies. So a lot of researchers that work and focus their work in the desirable difficulty strategies, they often ask students, once they explain to them what these strategies are, how they perceive these strategies as it relates to learning. It's not so good news. So students often think that once they learn something, there's no need to go back to it. Why would you space things? I mean, I have thought about that myself. Why should I go back to things that I learned in high school or in my first year of undergrad? It doesn't make sense. Or even, why would I go back to the topic that I learned in week 1 for my final exam if I already did the exam earlier in the semester? There's no need to go back to it. Students are lacking to notice patterns of connection that these different topics have with each other. They also think that retrieval practice is not that good for learning. They just don't believe it. They also would rather study in a blocked chronological manner than mixing the materials when they're studying for something. So they're not interleaving. Students, they often prefer their go-to methods, the methods that they have been doing since they were in an elementary school. They prefer rereading. Rereading is a very passive strategy compared to all these other strategies that I talked about. So why don't students use effective strategies? Maybe they don't know what they are, or maybe there's something else going on. So to test this hypothesis, we asked undergrad students to think about one of the three students: a bottom 10% student, an average student, or a top 10% student that is currently enrolled in college and is a STEM major. So we asked participants to think about one of these students, bring the image to mind, think about what this student does in and out of the class. Maybe that's someone that they know, maybe someone that they made up in their minds. And then once they had a clear image of this student and what they do, we asked them various questions related to their studying behaviors. So first, we asked participants, or students, undergrad students in that case, to report how frequently they thought this imagined student that they brought to mind would be using the following strategies: highlighting, rereading, note-taking, self-testing, and explaining. So from this question, our results showed that students reported the better students, so this top 10% student, as doing more of all of these strategies compared to the average and bottom 10% student. So this top 10% student is rereading more, highlighting more, self-testing more, and explaining more compared to the average or bottom 10% student. This question, however, gets at the quantity of use of strategies, but not really the quality of the strategies that this imagined student would be using. So to get to that question, we asked participants to rate which of two strategies this imagined student would be using more. So would they be self-explaining things more or having people explain things to them? Would they self-test more or would they reread more when they're studying for an exam? Would they interleave more or use blocking more? So this comparison gets to the comparison of more active versus less active strategies. So the top strategies, the self-explanation, self-testing, interleaving, would suggest, if students were reporting that strategy being used more frequently, more often by this student, that would suggest that this student has a more active, effective approach to learning. Compared to the bottom strategies that I have on the screen, so if they're listening to explanations, rereading, or blocking more, that would suggest to us that this imagined student has a more passive, less effective approach to learning. Our results for this question suggest that better students generally use more active strategies. So students reported that the top 10% student is just using more explanation compared to the average and top 10 and bottom 10% student. They're just explaining more things when they're studying for an exam. They're also self-testing more compared to rereading. And not only that, they're doing that more often than the average and bottom 10% student. We found no difference for interleaving. So they are 50-50 whether these students are using interleaving or blocking. As I mentioned earlier, interleaving is in my opinion, one of those more counterintuitive strategies. So I'm not surprised by the results here. It's hard for students to realize that interleaving is beneficial for learning. Overall, our results show that students kind of have a good sense of what good students do in order to succeed in their classes, what strategies they do. They use more strategies, but they also use more active strategies. So students have this cognitive understanding of what good students do, but knowing something doesn't mean you do something. So we wanted to investigate why students don't use these strategies. What are the barriers that they face when they are trying to use these strategies? So in a second study, students from an undergrad course in an American university were asked to report their number one barrier to not using effective learning strategies after they learned about all these strategies that we have been talking about this morning throughout the course. So in this course, students, they learned about these strategies. They learned how they worked. They learned why they were beneficial for learning. And they had various opportunities in the classroom to practice these strategies. So the professors in these classes, they would often propose questions, so students would retrieve information from earlier topics, and they would highlight that's what they were doing. Hey, we're doing retrieval practice right now. Let's recall information. Let's be engaged in our learning experience. So students really had the opportunity to learn and practice a lot of these strategies in this course. This course had 4 exams, and at the end of every exam, they had bonus questions that asked them to report their number one reason to not using these strategies that they learned and practiced in the classroom. So here are the options that we presented students with when they were asked to report their barriers. First, we are trying to get to the learning strategies barriers. So lack of strategy efficacy, or maybe lack of self-efficacy. So I don't think this strategy works. I don't think it will help me for this exam. Or I don't think I can do this strategy effectively. We also want to ask some questions related to metacognition and motivation. So we incorporated some barriers that related to time and effort costs. So I think this strategy requires too much effort from me. I don't think I have enough time to use this strategy. We also incorporated some psychological and emotional costs related to these strategies. So maybe they thought that these strategies are boring, or maybe these strategies made students feel anxious or nervous. What do you guys think was the number one reason students chose to not using effective learning strategies? You can just shout the answer if you want. I heard time. So if you were here for last night's talk by Dr. Gibalda, he mentioned that the number one reason people report to not doing exercise is time. Guess what? Students have the same perception about using effective learning strategies. So time was the number one reason, you were correct, that students reported to not using these effective learning strategies. So while we noticed that time was definitely scarce towards the end of the semester, probably because of final exams, final projects, final papers, time was an issue throughout the entire semester. Some other commonly reported barriers to using effective strategies were anxiety, effort costs, and lack of self-efficacy. So students felt anxious to use these strategies that are good for learning. They felt like these strategies require too much effort from them. Or they believed that they couldn't do these strategies effectively. So a lot of things going on here. The good news is that psychological cost for anxiety and lack of self-efficacy decreased throughout the semester. So perhaps students were more exposed to these strategies. They had more opportunities to practice them, and that probably made them feel less nervous to use them. Or maybe they also felt that they could do these strategies even better as they got practice with them. Okay, so when we are thinking about helping students to become self-regulated learners, my goal in grad school, we have to think about the barriers that they face. So time is an issue, not only for students. I'm sure a lot of us could relate in this room that we need more time in the day to do things, to get things done. But finding time to study in the first place is difficult for students. When time is running out, students often just go back to what they know, the strategies that they have used their entire lives, which sadly, those strategies are often passive strategies, like rereading, just looking through your notes, or just highlighting the textbook. They're not active when they're studying or using these strategies. Time management is difficult in college. Sometimes we wish students would be better at time management, but thinking back about my undergrad years, that was kind of a challenge. I had classes in the morning, one day, in the afternoon, the next day, evening classes sometimes, jobs, extracurricular activities, social life, and not only that, my schedule changed every semester. So it's hard, it's really difficult to make time to learn new things, incorporate new things when you already have a busy schedule. For about a year now, I have been conducting interviews, focus groups interviews with undergrad students and asking them about their experiences in college. Their experiences related to learning, strategies that they use for a class, and some of the barriers that they face during their college time. So I have a quote here that I think relates to this barrier, this time barrier that students often report to not being effective learners, from one of the students that we interviewed. So this student says, I work 2 jobs, and sometimes that's definitely an obstacle because then you're also thinking, I have to pay rent. So it's difficult to put academics first if you have to work to literally have a place to live. So sometimes it's more than just being organized with your time, finding time in your calendar to do things. Sometimes you're just thinking about what you have to do to pay rent, to buy food. You go from one class to one job to the next job, and then you sleep, and then you still have to allocate time to learn something new that is not necessarily required for your class. That's very difficult for students to choose to do. So maybe one way that instructors can facilitate the use of effective learning strategies in the classroom is to incorporate some of these strategies in their instructional designs. Obviously, teachers don't have time. We all lack time. So when I think about incorporating effective learning strategies into the classroom, I also need to keep in mind that we shouldn't require teachers, instructors to change the entire course. That would require too much time from them. But perhaps we can start incorporating some questions throughout lectures that would reinforce students to retrieve things that they learned in earlier weeks. Again, if you were here for the talk last night, Dr. Kim, Joe, mentioned that that's exactly what he does in his class. He proposes questions throughout the lectures to students that highlight things that they learned previously. Maybe this is something you already do, but some of my suggestions would be to maybe incorporate mini quizzes to students at the beginning of the class. Maybe you could put up some quicker questions through Poll Everywhere or Kahoot. I know those are commonly used platforms that you can see in real time students answer. Or maybe you can just do this informally, walk around and ask your students, hey, do you remember how this model works or what heuristics mean? We learned that in week 1. Can you try to answer that without looking at your notes? Again, maybe this is something you already do, but perhaps incorporating some of those questions will highlight to students that doing this active exercise will promote their long-term learning of materials. So maybe when you're doing those things, you highlight to students, hey, we're doing retrieval practice. We're spacing our study. Look how fun it is. It's good for your learning. So we also need to think about the psychological costs that involves using effective learning strategies. So trying something new that is often hard or more effortful, it's hard for students. It can also make them anxious, right? We don't want to provoke anxiety to students, maybe a little bit. So here's another quote from one of the students I interviewed. The fact that I'm doing or studying the night before, it means I really can try something new because I have to do what I have always done or I will fail the exam. So in this example, maybe the student was working 2 jobs. They came home at 8 p.m. They have an exam the next day. They could try to use retrieval practice, but the risk is too high for them. They want to succeed in their exam. So maybe they're just going to go to their default strategy because they don't want to be even more anxious about using something new. The good news is that with more practice and exposure to these strategies, the psychological costs seem to decrease over time. So perhaps incorporating these things, these strategies, and highlighting them throughout the semester will encourage students to feel more confident that they can use these strategies. They will feel less anxious when they are using them on their own time because they had all this time to practice in the classroom with their peers, with the professor that is there to help them use them effectively. Maybe now they can transfer these strategies to other classes. Okay, so here were some of my very basic suggestions that perhaps many of you already do. But I want to hear from you guys. What are things that you have done in your teaching to support effective learning strategies? And maybe I'll challenge you to think about something new you'd like to try. So let's take a few minutes to think about these questions. Share with your neighbor. Maybe your neighbor will tell you things that they do that will inspire you to try in your own class, and vice versa. And then after you chat for a little bit, we can share some interesting things that came up in these conversations to perhaps inspire other people in this room to start using these different approaches to instructional designs. Okay? So when you're thinking about this, try to keep in mind some of the barriers that I shared with you and how you could perhaps minimize some of them. Okay, let's chat. Okay, lots of conversations. Love that. Thanks again for being engaged and, being part of this talk with me. I have so much to learn from all of you guys, so this is very exciting for me. Okay, so let's hear some of the things that came up.
You'll like what I'm going to say now. So I attended this conference when Barb Oakley was your keynote, which was, 2018 or something, because I had done her Coursera course on learning how to learn. And I completely forgot that I did this before COVID, and it fell off the table. I'm going to bring it back on now. So what I used to do was, based on Barb Oakley's work, I teach finance to second-year students. So you would have been one of mine if you hadn't.
I know. Maybe in the next life.
Next life. But every week I would teach a different learning strategy to students. So I'd take 5 minutes. My lectures are 2 hours once a week. And I would take 5 minutes and say, okay, today we're going to learn about the Pomodoro method. And I'd talk a little bit about it. And then the following week I'd say, today we're going to learn about interleaving. And then, so I just did it, and it also provided the students with a little bit of a cognitive break during the lecture. And they loved it. I can't believe I forgot that I was doing this. And then I was on sabbatical, and then it was COVID, and I totally forgot that I did this. And you've reminded me now that the sort of extra piece that I've sort of picked up from what you've done today, I was just sort of teaching about the strategy, but I wasn't actually sort of putting it into practice in the class. So I think that's maybe something I'd like to reintroduce it and then add in, okay, so let's do some interleaving today and bring in whatever, figure out a way to do it. So there you go.
Maybe if I had a finance professor that was doing this, I wouldn't have quit my business major. But That's very interesting because when we think about exercise, for example, we know it's good for you, but it's really difficult to just get started. So there was a workshop yesterday that we were talking about how to motivate others or yourself. And one of the things that we were thinking about when it comes to exercise was to have an accountable person to do exercises with. So maybe professors, teachers are the accountable person that students need to use effective learning strategies. Maybe. Okay, who else? Thanks for sharing.
So I'm working on a project with Sharona actually to, Dr. Greenberg, sorry, to introduce an online study tool for students to support interleaving kind of in their regular study habits.
Mm-hmm.
So it's called ChemFast. We have a poster, a little bit of a self plug.
Check it out later.
Yeah. You go to the website and you choose either a unit or to practice all or practice for one of the tests. And it will give you practice problems from past tests and exams and interleave them randomly and then suggest the next question based on your skill estimated ability score. So if you get questions incorrectly, it will try and go towards easier questions based on what past students have done,
Mm-hmm.
like how well they've performed on those questions. So it's
Yeah.
trying to support interleaving, and I think we have ideas of introducing spaced repetition and
Mm-hmm.
trying to encourage yeah.
Love that. Thanks for sharing. Two things I want to highlight from this feedback is that this comment is that I'm very excited to see where technology and AI is gonna bring us in the future as far as effective learning strategies go. I'm really excited to see what's gonna happen in the future. And the other thing that you made me think of, and something that came up in the Zoom with the online audience, is that another important thing that we as instructors need to keep in mind is also giving feedback, right? So we might ask students to retrieve materials, and the hope is that they can do this on their own. But it's also important to highlight to students that they have to metacognitively assess their learning progress. Okay, you retrieved everything that you could right now, so go back and check and make sure you're recalling the correct information. So the feedback part that the platform that you guys are talking about has that. So that's also very important, and I want to highlight. Okay.
One of the I work not in schools but in workplaces, and early on in my career working with employed people, the word study got beaten out of me as an instructor. So I use the word learning as opposed to study.
Mm.
And I think language is really, really important. And we have to be really careful with what we call things,
Mm-hmm.
because it focuses people on what they think that word means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things I think formal education can take from what we do in the adult learning world is we talk about learning. We don't talk about things that are academic.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't
Yeah.
mean that we're not being effective as teachers and facilitators and trainers. It's just that we use a different language.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've acculturated our students to a very particular use of language around their learning.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get to the point where we need to expand their metacognitive abilities, we have a lot of difficulty introducing the language to them at that point. And the other thing I think we need to look at is, what are we doing? There's some very effective early childhood education programs, Montessori and Reggio come to mind. And I don't see enough of research or examples of how they're doing things. What can we continue to do those things so that when they get to post-secondary, our job is a lot easier as instructors and professors, because we have effective learners coming to us, we don't have to train them on the fly.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, language is very important in educational context, like failure. Failure is a good thing. When you fail, it's an opportunity for you to grow. Learning versus studying. I agree. Studying often has this connotation that it's boring, that should feel boring. We don't want to study. But we love to learn. We learn all the time. We learn new hobbies. We learn a new video game. We learn a new exercise. So I totally agree with you, and thank you for the comment.
I just had one quick example I do. During the midterm in my introductory psychology course, we actually have an entire unit called the Science of Learning, where they learn all about these things. And they agree. They think, yeah, this is good.
Yeah.
We should do that. And then at the beginning of the week, I tell them, this Friday, you have a midterm. Okay, I want you to look in your calendar right now and look at the rest of your schedule, and I want you to determine how much time you have left to study, prepare for this midterm. I don't care what you've been doing up to this date, but just the rest of this week, and come up with an actual number. Maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's 8 hours, whatever that is. Next, I want you to divide that number into 2 or 3 separate sessions, and then actually put into your calendar right now. We actually spend 5 minutes doing this in class. Everyone feels a little bit silly doing it, but I've had many students come up to me afterwards and said, you know, if we didn't actually do it in class, I probably would not have done this, and I would have just studied just the night before. And so what I'm telling people, I don't even want you to study more. I want you to take that same amount that you would have crammed the night before and just spread it out across the week, and you will do better. And so I think that's an example of just like actual intervention to get people to do what might be better for them.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for everyone that shared and, talked with your neighbor. I hope we can continue these conversations throughout the day so we all can get inspired by each other. I'm towards the end of my talk. I wish I could talk all day long, but other interesting people are going to be talking today. But just to recap, and some of the key takeaways I would love for you guys to get from this talk is that changing perspectives of difficulty in learning context may be one of the push that students need to embrace effective learning strategies, like the language component that we were just talking about. The language that we use in the classroom will signal messages to students that they will retain that throughout their college career, educational career. So highlighting that things are difficult, things that require effort are often really good for growth, just like running a mile that I don't like doing. The other thing is that getting familiar with effective learning strategies, so the desirable difficulty strategies or approaches that you think is going to enhance students' experiences, it's another thing that students need to decrease some of those barriers, right? Like get familiar, feel less anxious about using them, feel more confident you can use them, right? Like that's how you do in exercises. You start running 1 mile. Once you feel like you can do that, you push yourself to do more. So let's push our students to be more active, to do a little more engaged studying or learning. And lastly, perhaps we are the accountable buddy that students need to help decrease some of those barriers by incorporating these strategies into our instructional designs. So I would like to briefly thank my lab that has helped me throughout this project, teachers, students, long-time professors that gave me a lot of feedback of the things that they heard from students. And that's very important for me to hear what students have to say when I think about changes that I would like to make and try to help them to become more effective learners. So if you want to connect, if you have any questions, you can scan the QR code. Thank you so much for listening to me talk. Do you have time for questions?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, we have time for
Okay, so if anyone has questions or comments, now is the time to do so.
Thank you for your talk, Stephany. In the study you did, you gave students the option of choosing learning strategies or rating them. I'm not convinced that students know these strategies if you didn't give them the option. So did you have any free report option where you asked students what the strategies of the top 10% are?
We did. For that study specifically, we didn't. But we didn't the goal of that study was not to get students to know about effective learning strategies. We didn't really control for prior knowledge about the effective learning strategies, but we didn't want to prime them with these strategies. We want to see if they would be able to recognize just by simpler language of like self-testing or explaining things to yourself. Would that itself would be enough to signal to participants that that's an active, better strategy? So no, we didn't ask that. But that was kind of one of the goals with that study specifically. We want to see if students or participants would recognize those things without providing them some of those jargon words, the go-to words. Does that answer your question? Okay, we can talk more.
Okay, one quick question. How confident are you that interventions can work?
Yes.
So, I mean, we have that problem, like with exercise. Like everyone is convinced, yes, exercise is good.
Right.
But last night, Marty Gabala noted that I think it's the time, like the effort involved. So, and then he talked about minimum effective doses, like just at least do this.
Yeah.
Like, do we need studies like that here? Like, here's the minimum effective study that you need to do.
So I have two things to say to that question. The first one is that I don't know if you're familiar with WISE psychological interventions, but those are like quick interventions that really focus on one psychological construct that you would like to change in the classroom. And they have shown to be very effective. And so I do think that some quick interventions can work, can be beneficial for students. But the issue that I have with WISE or quicker interventions is that creating habits is very difficult. So the interventions might work in the classroom, maybe until like they can be transferred to another semester. But it's really difficult for students to maintain those things that they're learning in the classroom. So you mentioned that we really need to start thinking about earlier educational years, right? And I think that the necessary change that we need is that students in elementary school or maybe even kindergarten are exposed to languages that promote effective learning. I think that's where we're going to see the biggest change. But I do think some interventions can work.
Okay.
I don't think it's a yes or no question answer, but that's what I think.
Some interesting studies to come.